Hello, welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. We will be discussing Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance this week, and I have my teaching assistant here to help us. So before you listen to this video lecture, please watch the lecture on Ralph Waldo Emerson by the School of Life, which I posted above. It will give you some intellectual and historical background so that you have an easier time understanding Emerson. One of the things the video talks about is the fact that Emerson is a part of an intellectual movement in America in the 19th century that also involves people like Emily Dickinson, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. So these thinkers were trying to transform the American intellectual tradition away from their sort of European heritage. They were saying that we need to think about the here and now. We need to think like contemporary Americans and not be so caught up in these traditions from the past. Another thing you learned in the video is that Emerson is a pantheist, which means he thinks that God is everywhere and in everything from the blade of grass to the stars in the sky. And that means you can discover God everywhere. Even ordinary things can be extraordinary. And that also means the same thing for people. So everyone has the divine spark within them. And that means you need to look within to your intuitions and your inner voice to find the truth and not be so worried about things like institutions. Social, political, and religious institutions can often block us from listening to the truth that we find within ourselves. Before we start talking about self-reliance, I want to say a little bit about this word. So sometimes when you hear the word self-reliance, you might think someone who's really independent, who does everything on their own, someone who says they like pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and they don't need anyone. And maybe they're kind of selfish and they look down on other people who do need help. And that is not what Emerson means by this word at all. For him, self-reliance means trusting yourself, not necessarily getting rid of other people in your life, but trusting your thoughts and ideas. And for him, that actually makes you more of a kind, generous, authentic, good person. It's not going to make you a selfish person. It will actually make you a moral person. And we'll spend some time thinking about that today. So he starts this essay by talking about genius, and genius is very important for his concept of self-reliance or trusting yourself. And that's because for him, genius means following your own intuition. Now, this might be a little different than what we typically think of when we hear the word genius. So if I ask you, think of a genius, right? Think of someone who's a genius. Maybe in your head you have Frida Kahlo as an example, right? A great painter, someone who really transformed painting and whose work has had a huge impact in the world. Maybe you think of someone like Albert Einstein, who came up with a new theory that transformed the way we think about the universe. Maybe you think of people who are exceptionally brilliant or exceptionally talented in a particular way, and they stand out as being really exceptional. When Emerson says genius, he means someone who trusts themselves, someone who listens to the voice within them and expresses that to the outer world. So we can all be geniuses for Emerson. Everyone has intuition. Everyone has the spark of divine within them. And the problem is that we don't trust ourselves, that we don't develop our own talents and our own ways of thinking, and instead we follow along with others. So starting on page 1, he says, I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter which were original and not conventional. Right, so he's reading something by a famous painter, and what strikes him is that it's so original. It doesn't follow the conventions or expectations or norms that one would expect. And he says the soul always hears an admonition in such lines. Right? You hear it kind of cry out to you. It stands out to you and resonates with you when it's original. And he says that it gives you this certain sentiment. What genius tells you is that you need to believe yourself. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. right? So trusting yourself, believing in yourself, that's what makes you a genius. He says at the bottom of page 1, a man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. Right? So when you're inspired, it's like you're struck with this light, right? You have this gleam of light that flashes in your mind when you have a great idea. And he says we need to trust that moment of inspiration more than the luster of bards, right? Great poets or sages, great philosophers, great thinkers. So the inspiration within is more important than any inspiration you're going to find in other people's words. Yet we often don't think this way, right? He says, yet he dismisses without notice his thought because it is his, right? So this is the problem. We think our own thoughts are unimportant and we pay more attention to the thoughts of other people. Oscar Wilde expressed the same opinion. He said that most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions, their lives a mimicry, their passions a quotation. Right? So instead of thinking for ourselves, we simply say what other people think. Instead of living our own lives, we do what other people do. And instead of finding what we're passionate about and pursuing that, we simply echo what other people are passionate about. And Emerson that says that if we're inspired by a work of genius, it's not because of the idea that's there, it's not because of the particular thing that person says, it's because it's teaching us to follow our own intuitions. So on page 2, he says at the very top, in every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Right? So we're recognizing in a great painting or a great work of literature or a movie, if you're thinking more contemporary, right? So what we're recognizing in that, according to Emerson, isn't something that that person thought alone. It's something we've thought too, right? It's some sort of insight into the world. But instead of us expressing our own insight, we're getting it now from the outside, from someone else who has developed it. So he says, great works of art have no more affecting lesson than this. They teach us to abide by our spontaneous impression with good-humored inflexibility than most when the whole cry of voices is on the other side, right? So great works of art teach us, hey, we have great ideas. You have great ideas. Trust your ideas. Do something with them. And he says, otherwise, else, tomorrow a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our opinion from another. Right? So if we don't develop our own ideas, we end up seeing those ideas out in the world, other people saying them, and so we have to kind of then take them secondhand from other people. So Emerson wants us to develop our own genius and find our own inspiration in ourselves rather than always be inspired by other people and taking our thoughts and opinions from others. So to think about this, we can turn to page 10 and 11, where he talks about the difference between intuition and institutions. So intuition is your inner voice. It is where you find your genius. And it comes from your own lived experiences. What have you experienced in your life? What are your thoughts and reflections on that? And that, for Emerson, is primary wisdom. That's the most important fundamental source of wisdom, is that inner voice of your intuition. He says that this is where we get inspiration from, right? So our inspiration to act, our inspiration to think, our inspiration to live all comes from intuition. And that's why he calls it the fountain of action and thought. He says that this is the voice of intuition is in the present. It lives now. It's about the here and now, the present moment. And all of these aspects of intuition are very different from what he calls tuition. So tuition is teachings. It is sort of institutionalized forms of knowledge, either social, political, or educational sort of teachings and traditions that are passed down. So this has to do with what others say and think, what sort of books and ideas get passed down from generation to generation. And this means, since it is what other people are saying and writing down in books and passing down, that it comes from other people's experiences, right? So intuition is your own experience, and tuition is other people giving you thoughts and feelings from their experiences. So that means that instead of being primary wisdom, it ends up becoming kind of a secondhand knowledge. That other person had that experience, they pass it to you, now it's secondhand knowledge when you have it. And he says that we tend to favor this form of knowledge over our own experiences and intuitions because history, we give it this type of authority. We think that because something's very old, it automatically becomes more important. And so he says that we practice this worship of the past. And that's partly what he's trying to question in this essay, Self-Reliance, is the fact that we think the past is more important than the present. If something's old, it has more meaning than what we're experiencing here and now. And he doesn't want us to think that way, particularly because when we value what other people think, when we value the past over the present, it ends up making us very timid. To talk about this, he uses the example of roses, roses growing outside his window. He says, man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but quotes some saint or sage. Right? So we're so timid and we're always apologizing and editing ourselves. And so we don't stand upright and say, this is who I am and this is what I think. And instead we just end up quoting someone who we believe has a lot of knowledge or wisdom, like a saint or a sage. And he says, you know, we should be ashamed before a blade of grass or a blowing rose because they don't have that experience. They're very different. He says, these roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time to them. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. Its nature is satisfied, and it satisfies nature in all moments alike. Right? So a rose is just a rose. It exists. It is the way it is. It doesn't compare itself to other roses. It's not sort of looking back at the past to compare itself to roses from the past. It really is just fully itself, fully embracing itself. And that makes it perfect, right? So it lives in the present and it embraces itself. And he says, but you know, humans are different. Humans, the man postpones or remembers, right? So we look to the past. We don't live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him, stand on tiptoe to foresee the future. So we're so worried about how we measure up to the past, and we're so worried about the future, what's going to happen in the future, right? That we end up really not being in the present. And he says he cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present above time. So Emerson's trying to get us to embrace the here and now, which is this moment when we can be intuitive, we can be open to nature, we can be open to the divine. And he doesn't want us to kind of be weighed down with this concern for the past or the future. On page 2, he makes two very strong points about this. He says, envy is ignorance and imitation is suicide, right? So envy means when you're really concerned that someone else has something better than you do, or that someone else is better than you, right? It's concern over others and sort of elevating them above you in a way where you're sort of not recognizing what you yourself have. So for Emerson, that's going to be ignorance. If you're envious of what someone else has, that means you're ignoring or not paying attention to what you yourself do have. And he thinks we all have the spark of the divine in us. We're all geniuses if we develop ourselves. And so there's no reason to be envious of what someone else has. He uses this image of kind of cultivating soil on page 2, right? He says that, you know, each person has a sort of plot of land where you can grow something. And you shouldn't be envious of what other people are growing because they have different land, right? So soil grows different things. If we're in upstate New York, that's a wonderful place for growing apples. And so if I'm New York, I shouldn't be upset that I can't grow mangoes, because you need a tropical soil to grow mangoes. And if I'm really envious of mangoes and want mangoes, that means that I'm probably ignorant of what I have to offer, that I have this really rich, wonderful soil, but I need to grow apples in my soil, right? So we need to not be envious. Instead, we need to look within and find what we have to develop. And he also says that imitation is suicide, right? That's a really radical statement. When we pretend to be someone else, when we're pretending to be someone we're not, for Emerson, that's extremely self-destructive. That's the same thing as essentially killing yourself. And so he wants us to be true to ourselves and not try to be other people or have what other people have. He says, trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. And he turns to the example of children to say that children are a great example of this. So if we look at the bottom of page 2, he says, what pretty oracles nature yields to us in the face and behavior of children and babes. Right? So babies and children show us what it means to truly trust yourself and your instincts and listen to your intuition. At the top of page 3, he talks about how if you look at a baby, babies aren't worried what other people think, right? They're not sort of busying themselves about other people. Instead, all like 4 or 5 adults are all hovered around this baby, trying to make this baby happy. So the baby just expresses what it needs, it cries or wails, and everyone else is tending to that baby who's expressing exactly what they need. And he says children too are like this. He says they are nonchalant, right? They are kind of carefree, and they just are who they are. They don't try to please anyone. And so they have this healthy attitude of human nature. They're the same in a parlor or in a playhouse, right? They don't edit their behavior depending on the social circumstance or where they are. And they don't cumber themselves about consequences, right? They're not worried about the consequences. They say and do what they like. And for that reason, he says they give independent, genuine verdicts. They're always going to say what they think. So children, this is how they are. They're not yet aware of what we as adults are aware of. And for Emerson, what changes us from children to adults is becoming aware of other people's judgments of us. He says that as soon as a child acts or speaks in a way where he's aware that others are watching him, right? He says he's a committed person watched by the sympathy or hatred of hundreds whose affections must now enter into his account. So, right, as we kind of age, we get socialized, and part of socialization is realizing that when you do something or say something, other people are forming judgments about that, right? Other people are viewing it and witnessing it, and they think certain things about you. And so we kind of stop being natural and kind of begin to be more of a performance that we do for other people, right? So we want to be seen a certain way, and that means we don't always do exactly what we say or think or feel, because we're concerned with how that looks to other people. And so that sort of natural carefree attitude of children in adulthood gets sort of replaced with conformity to other people's expectations. So describes society as a joint stock company, and it requires that people conform to it so that we can better secure bread, right? So it's this joint stock company where everyone conforms and everyone benefits, everyone kind of has this shared stake. And so self-reliance is an aversion to this. We end up having to sacrifice our liberty and our own individual culture in order to participate in something that gives us material security, but doesn't necessarily help us as individuals. So he says, society loves not realities and creators, but names and customs, right? Established names, established customs, ways of doing things. And so society can be really, really resistant to change, to creators or innovators. And even when reality suggests that change is needed, sometimes society prefers to keep things the same. He says that Even charity can be an example of this. So sometimes we talk about negative conformity and sometimes we talk about positive conformity, like where there's a benefit to that sort of thing that you're conforming to. And giving to charity is one of the examples Emerson talks about, like giving money because you're worried what other people think about you. And he says that that doesn't actually benefit anyone. It's just conforming to other people's expectations. And we can kind of see contemporary examples of this. For example, to raise money for ALS, there was this big ice bucket challenge where people would dump a bucket of ice water on their head, and celebrities were doing this. So there were, this became really, really popular on social media. And it drew a lot of attention to ALS and the need, the sort of need to raise research funding for this really difficult deteriorative disease. However, in the end, it didn't actually raise that much money. People aren't sure how much it actually benefited. In a way, it kind of was more of a distraction or a way of getting attention than something that actually benefited anyone. Another example of this is the character Tahani from the TV show The Good Place, if you've seen that. So The Good Place, right, takes place in the place where if you are good, you die, right? So heaven. And we get this character at the beginning where she seems really great. She's done a lot to raise money for charities. She's raised millions and millions and millions of dollars. She's really well known for her charity. But throughout the plots, it kind of becomes evident that she doesn't really care that much for people or try to help them. She's more interested in the attention she gets. And so she is doing all this charitable work for herself, and it doesn't actually end up being for other people. So she cares more about what other people think about her, and for that reason, she doesn't actually end up doing something that's good for others. So Emerson disagrees with this. He thinks my life is for itself and not for spectacle. So if you're making a great deal of yourself as look at me, look what a great person I am, you're probably not actually being a great person, right? You're probably more interested in what other people think about you. So you're not genuinely doing something kind or loving for someone else. It's not easy, though, to trust yourself and to kind of do your own thing and to not conform to others. Emerson says, "It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." So it takes a lot of strength and bravery and vulnerability to be able to be yourself out there in the world with other people. And he also talks about the fact that a lot of times we're conforming because of other people's expectations that we kind of be the same person or we be consistent and our behavior be as consistent as possible. So he says that what scares us from self-reliance, from self-trust, is our consistency, a reverence for our past act or word, because the eyes of others have no other data for computing our orbit than our past acts, and we are loath to disappoint them. Right? So other people have certain expectations of how we'll act that are based on how we've acted in the past, right? We have this sort of character or this personality that they think they understand based on our actions from the past. And we don't want to break from that because we're worried about disappointing or confusing other people. And Emerson says that that again is a mistake. To be great is to be misunderstood. So on page 7, he lists a bunch of great thinkers who are misunderstood. Pythagoras, who's a very ancient and famous mathematician, was misunderstood. And Socrates and Jesus and Luther and Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. Right? So these thinkers often introduce such radically new ideas that people don't really understand them in their own time. And so if you're being original and if you're being great, frequently other people are not going to understand you. So that's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. In fact, it might be a sign that you're doing something really well. Walt Whitman describes a similar idea in his poem Song of Myself. He says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." I love this poem and the idea of containing multitudes because I think it's true of what a lot of people experience. You are many things, and a lot of those different things might not kind of fit together in a nice, neat way, right? So we often feel this kind of pressure to simplify ourselves for other people and not contradict ourselves. But if you're a complex, interesting person, there are going to be contradictions. So I remember as a teenager feeling a lot of pressure to fit in with different social cliques I was a part of. So one clique I was a part of was kind of the grunge rock alternative scene. It was the late 90s, early 2000s. So I'd go to these concerts wearing, flannel shirts and raggedy jeans and crowd surf, and it was a lot of fun. But I was also a ballet dancer. So I would wear a tutu and dance to classical music on stage. And I had a friend who was part of the grunge rock scene kind of call me out and say, "You're a poser because you're this ballerina. How can you like both, grunge and ballet?" And so he saw me as contradicting myself, and that made me less authentic. But really, we all have many different interests, and we don't have to make sense to other people. We can be large and we can contain multitudes. Um, so another image that Emerson gives us for why we don't have to worry about contradicting ourselves or changing paths or kind of growing in different directions is that this is sort of what a journey looks like. So your life is like a journey, and he uses the example of a sea voyage to kind of explain this. So he says the voyage of the best ship is a zigzag line of 100 tacks, right? So what he's saying here is if you look at a ship, it has to constantly change direction, right? There might be a storm, and so it got too far north, so it has to go south. Or maybe it's just constantly sort of readjusting so it can get towards whatever destination it's trying to arrive at. And so if you look at it on this sort of close scale, it looks like it's constantly changing direction and not really going anywhere. And that's how we can kind of feel sometimes if we are changing a lot or doing things differently, right? Life can be very messy. But Emerson says if you take a sufficient distance, like if you look at the map as a whole and you see the origin and the destination of that ship, it forms this average tendency. It forms this perfect line as if the ship never went off course, right? So that's sort of what life is like. And this is what Emerson wants us to think about when he's telling us to trust ourselves and rely on our intuition, is that life is this journey as a whole. And we need to trust our instincts, and we need to explore who we are and make the best of that journey. And we kind of make sense as we go. And we don't necessarily have to worry about what other people think about what we're doing, as long as we're being true to ourselves.